the department newsletter, which will keep you apprised to all upcoming lectures made possible through this historic program. My name is Harris Dino, a first-year MFA candidate studying ceramics here at CU Boulder. Tonight's presentation will consist of the artist talk, followed by a brief Q&A, which will be moderated by me. When the artist presentation is finished, please type your questions into the chat box on the right side of the video on YouTube. This evening, we are joined by transdisciplinary artist Nicki Green. Working primarily in clay, Green's sculptures, ritual objects, and various flat works explore topics of history preservation, conceptual ornamentation, and the aesthetics of otherness. Often constructing heavily ornamented painted glazed surfaces and employing experimental organic building techniques, Green explores material and object integrity by utilizing transness as a lens with which to look at the world. She received a BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute in 2009 and an MFA from UC Berkeley in 2018. Now living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area, Green has exhibited internationally, notably at the New Museum in New York, the Paris Museum of Modern Art in France, and the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, to name just a few. She has contributed texts to numerous publications, including Transgender Studies Quarterly, Fermenting Feminism Copenhagen, and her most recent publication, Between Sunlight and Shadow, Transvocality as Talmudic Process, can be found through the Centers for Arts Research Publications at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Green has been recognized as a 2020 Art Matters Fellow and a 2019 John Michael Kohler Art Center resident, and a San Francisco Museum of Modern Art SICA Award finalist, among many other awards and residencies. Now please join me in welcoming Nicki Green.
Thank you so much, Harris, for that introduction. And thank you so much to Kirsten and Ben and the entire CU Boulder community. It's really such a kind of honor to come close out the Visiting Artist Lecture Series. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to chat about my practice with you all tonight. Okay, so I at one point met with an art historian who talked about the kind of problematics of talking about the sort of narrative origins of art making, that there's this kind of bizarre kind of fixation that we have on trajectory and art practice as this kind of linear experience. And while I really understand that, I think I have a lot of interest in this idea of kind of the foundations of an art practice, what is sort of driving the art practice forward into its sort of current incarnations, and also sort of how it evolves over time. And so I am going to talk about the kind of, maybe not linear, but the trajectory of my art practice up until this kind of current point. And I'm starting with this image here from undergrad at San Francisco Art Institute of my honors studio, which I sort of lovingly referred to as the pit, because I would sort of just pile materials into this space and really play with both a sort of range of material practices, but also I think I was really interested in kind of accumulation and the context, the kind of literal physical context of one's workspace, and how that kind of articulates how the work evolves. So there's a lot about this kind of image that really holds a lot of kind of energy for me about that time and place, not least of which the fact that I'm holding a piece from my thesis show, my undergrad thesis show, which was really, I think, the first time that I started playing with the kind of heavily painted or heavily ornamented blue and white, or I would even say now like sort of blue and white adjacent glazed surface. And yeah, I think like that's a really kind of major component of my work now, and it's evolved heavily from this point in time, but this was really kind of the origin of it. So these are some images of the thesis work. This body of work was called Sex Objects. And I think in my kind of early conception of the sort of painted or illustrated or ornamented glazed surface, I was really considering what it means to make sort of like a floral, ornate femme surface that is sort of contrasted by an object, but an object or like a body, a body part, let's say, that is like sort of not considered like ornate or femme or sort of aesthetic in its nature. And so there was something, I think, in a really immediate sense that was really satisfying for me, where I was like, what does it mean to make a phallus, a dildo, a sex object, delicate and femme and aesthetic? And I look at this now many years later, and I see so many components of these pieces that I find sort of like a little cringeworthy, but also like I sort of understand them as the origin of this practice, or the kind of first iteration of this practice. And you'll see as I start to move through later work that so much of my practice feels like it's about the sort of layering of iterations and the evolution of an idea, both through accumulation, the kind of palimpsest, the way that an idea sort of picks up both momentum, but also picks up its kind of surroundings as it evolves. Yeah, let's see. So soon after I graduated, I started dating this guy in the Bay Area, who is now my partner. It's been 11 years that we've been together, but he is Dutch. And prior to us meeting, I had been making that previous work, those sex objects, with this idea of like, oh, the blue and white surface, it's like ornate painted ceramics. And I don't think that like instinctually it felt sort of important, or even like I don't think that there was that initial drive to be like what is this glazed surface even, but just that like the glazed surface exists. And actually like only recently I was reading an interview with a New England-based ceramic artist who also kind of engages the blue and white surface, or sort of employs the blue and white, the kind of cobalt on white glaze surface. And he was talking about how the trade routes from the Netherlands specifically into Boston and New England kind of generally made it so specifically Delftware, meaning the blue and white ceramics being produced in the town of Delft, were specifically coming through New England, which was really interesting to me, because I grew up in Boston, and so much of my drive to kind of employ that initial blue and white surface was just about sort of its most immediate kind of recognizability to me. Like this this is a surface that I am aware of or have been aware of for a lot of my life. I don't really know much about it, but there's something about its kind of proximity to the home and the kind of domestic space that feels exciting to me. And so it was kind of satisfying or even kind of affirming to hear that actually its proximity was for this very specific reason about like the way that these wares moved from Europe into the US. Anyway, as I sort of finished undergrad, met my partner BJ, and was able to start traveling to the Netherlands to visit my now in-laws. But also there was this kind of amazingly serendipitous understanding that I suddenly had access to Delft and to Dutch ceramic industry in a much more kind of firsthand way. And I was able to do some site visits to the Royal Delft factory. This image on the left is the first visit that I made there. And they have this kind of very kind of elaborate tourist attraction where these like molds come up out of the ground and sort of open, and these pots sort of like fly out of the molds and are spinning. It's like this very kind of elaborate situation. But for me, what was really exciting was they had a museum of historical Delft objects, and then part of the sort of choreographed movement through the factory allowed you to sort of witness the craftspeople in the factory working on the products that the factory produces. And there were all of these really specific details that became really exciting to me. Things like the shapes of the brushes, the viscosity of the colorants that they're using, like the way that the brushes are sort of touching the surfaces of the ceramic forms. And something that really stuck with me and has continued to be an ongoing exploration of this material for me is these historical objects that become damaged over time, but in their damaging, chip and reveal the clay bodies underneath this glaze surface. It was something that I sort of noticed almost immediately and really fixated on. So these images that were pulled out of a cesspit are sort of revealing through their cracks the, in this case, this kind of buff or like off-white clay body. But something that really revealed to me kind of conceptually is that the white glaze, the opaque white glaze that the cobalt is painted onto, is actually acting as sort of a mimic or like a way to kind of disguise the clay body that is not sort of like bright white or sort of like pure, quote unquote, pure white. And that the glaze itself is this kind of mimesis. It creates this kind of surface that's sort of ideal for painting on and sort of creating kind of narrative on top of, but also for maintaining the integrity of the surface. And, I learned over time that there's this really kind of fascinating back and forth that had been happening, kind of like ninth century, the sort of ninth century development of these ceramic wares was happening almost simultaneously in China. That was, and that industry was receiving their cobalt from the Middle East, and in turn, the Islamic pottery that was being produced also with cobalt was being painted with this opaque white glaze to mimic the brightness of Chinese porcelain. And so there's this kind of necessary back and forth that's happening that creates a kind of like a balance or kind of a reciprocal exchange of both materials, but also aesthetics, and allowing sort of each industry to develop the aesthetics that are so kind of quintessential to their wares. And from that exchange, really, like the Moors in Spain, who were in relationship with the like Muslim communities producing the Islamic pottery in Iraq, brought these ceramic wares into Spain, which then moved sort of throughout Europe and sort of evolved based on the countries that they were moving through, and also into South America, and then eventually into the US. But something that's kind of interesting here is that the language that often gets used is this word maiolica, which is actually specifically referring to Italian, what's called sort of tin glazed earthenware, meaning tin is opacifying the glaze and making it sort of bright and white and useful for painting on top of. So I'm going to keep saying maiolica because that has become kind of a catch-all in sort of ceramic fields for like an opaque white glaze with some kind of painted surface. But there's this kind of interesting thing where maiolica is actually kind of a specificity. It's kind of like a Kleenex thing, kind of. Anyway, in relationship to that sort of chipping glaze surface, I was, I think, really interested in the ways in which the white glaze surface was being used to perform integrity, perform sort of object integrity, the continuity of like a sort of pure white surface and the continuity of like a painting. But there were these moments, these kind of rare moments when the making process would kind of fail. And so this image on the right shows a kind of echo or like a ghost of the transfer process, maybe even the firing process here. And then that last image that I showed with the broken plates, the kind of breaking of the white surface to reveal the clay underneath. So there's these moments of failure that actually, I think, become even more exciting to me than the objects themselves. And that's was a sort of thing, a concept that I started to try to explore intentionally, like really intentionally, as I started making work. So some of this early work that I'm continuing to kind of explore today is using brick, so like found brick, as a tile surface. And I spent some time kind of developing a glaze recipe that would be sort of accepted by the brick material, and then sort of slap a glaze layer onto the surface of the brick and then paint what I was sort of thinking of as like queer florals. These, I guess on the left side, these pansy forms that have this kind of either kind of verbal relationship to queerness, right? Like pansy, this kind of vernacular connection. I was making carnations, stems of lavender, etc. And over time, that floral kind of interest in the floral pattern evolved into an interest in fungal patterns. And I'll talk more about fungus soon. But you can see here, I'm sort of thinking about repetition, the sort of rhythm of multiples, and sort of pattern making and kind of the ornamental surface as this like kind of queer tactic for creating objects that sort of feel queer. At least I thought so. I was also at this time thinking about what a queer ritual object might look like. And something that I sort of came to was this idea that um, riot and sort of revolution is this queer experience, this queer sort of rite of passage that gets kind of passed down either verbally through the kind of like history passing of queer people to each other, but also this kind of activity that feels kind of inherent to, say, the struggle of existing in a kind of straight, hetero, cis normative world. And so the brick became this kind of exciting object that felt like both, on one hand, aesthetic and functional, but also can be sort of picked up and thrown as this um, very sort of immediate and powerful tool of revolution. And so this body of work also included um, jugs, like alcohol jugs that I was sort of stuffing hankies into the necks of and sort of referring to them as Molotov cocktails. But then doing these kind of glaze surfaces on the bottles themselves. I also, at this time, started to consider what a way back into my religious and kind of spiritual practice might look like. I grew up in a Jewish community and immediately sort of left as soon as I was sort of able to, because I really felt like my queerness and my transness was at odds with a sort of relationship to religious community. And as an adult, I started to think about using the ritual object and sort of objecthood as a way sort of back into a relationship with Jewishness and Jewish community. And so I started making these tulipier forms, which is very much sort of a direct, like pointing to Delft ceramic history, but also like kind of vesselhood as this really kind of common and ubiquitous practice in ceramic. Ceramic, sort of the ceramics field, I guess, and thinking about like if I were making sort of ritual objects, but sort of heavily painted vessels that were sort of just generally about the kind of like sort of holding or containing of space, but they were being made for queer and trans people. What would they look like? And so I was painting both historical images and then also the kind of amalgamation of symbols and patterns that sort of fed into this kind of narrative of the kind of status or sort of space that these objects hold in the world. And you can see here, like the seams were really important to me, to have these really kind of visible seams where the glaze is kind of breaking over the seams or the edges of the object. And again, revealing the clay underneath. The material is sort of inherently failing. And maybe that sort of like failure of a material whose job is to be sort of like flawless, intact, is actually kind of like a queer engagement with material or a kind of queering of the object. Maybe around this time, maybe sort of parallel to that work, I started doing research um, from that kind of instinct around like queer florals, and thinking about the way that queerness kind of exists in the natural world. And something that came up in my kind of internet searching, library digging, et cetera, was this kind of amazing text, kind of horrifying, kind of amazing text called The Poisonous Mushroom from 1938, which was specifically a piece of Nazi propaganda that was being marketed towards children, and is actually, like, after many years of kind of looking at this book and kind of processing what this book sort of means in the world, I really started to sort of refer to it as this kind of field guide where like Aryan children are being sort of like um, coached into being able to recognize Jewish bodies in the world. And so, the narrative here is like this child is mushroom picking with his mother and says like, "Mom, can I eat this mushroom?" And she says no. And I have some more images from this book and the kind of evolution of that narrative on this next page, where the mother says, um, however they disguise themselves or however friendly they try to be, affirming 1,000 times their good intentions to us, one must not believe them. Jews they are, and Jews they remain. For our folk, they are poison. Like the poisonous mushroom, says Franz. Yes, my child, just as a single poisonous mushroom can kill a whole family, so a solitary Jew can destroy a whole village, a whole city, even an entire folk. So this idea that like the Jew as a poisonous mushroom, or the Jewish body as a sort of poisonous organism entity, is the kind of metaphor that's being played here or sort of being introduced here. But something that I found really interesting about this is that the poisonousness is actually not just that maybe Jewish people have this kind of ability to poison a society, but that in the context of Nazi Germany, this was produced in Berlin. This book was produced in Berlin, but like in the context of Nazi Germany, Ashkenazi Jews, in some ways, assimilated into non-Jewish culture pretty seamlessly, and that sort of seamless integration is what is so threatening about Jewish bodies, is that there's this inability to discern who is and who isn't Jewish. And so really, like, maybe in some ways the caricature that's being used throughout this book is actually about sort of making more extreme and therefore more recognizable, like the Jewish face or the Jewish body. But the whole book is sort of anecdotes about like where to find a Jew, so you can kind of protect yourself. And I felt like there was a really kind of exciting threading into a kind of interest in queerness, and specifically transness, and the kind of fluctuating relationship to visibility and assimilation that is engaged through medical transition, or sort of the lack thereof, and the way that that sort of threatens cis people's understandings of gender and presentation and the kind of performance of gender. And so this felt like an exciting metaphor to start to play with in my work. And it actually allowed me to take kind of a step back from this vessel work that I was making and think about the kind of organic, less kind of rigid, like capital C ceramic, kind of capital V vessel form. And so I started building these like large mushrooms and like trying to fill spaces with them and think of them as figures. So you can see here, like I'm referring to them as figures, morel figures, and building them really without very much plan, just kind of like building them out into space and sort of seeing how it feels um, to move through space with these like large objects that feel like they're kind of like proliferating in a very queer, kind of abject, kind of uncanny way. And I think over time I started to play with also the integrity of the exterior of the form, right? Like sort of um, similar themes as the kind of vessel work, but like what happens if these forms start to push their interiors outwards? What happens when these forms reach out and touch each other? What happens if they reach out and touch like inanimate objects? These like stacks of bricks that were sort of built to support the object as I was building them, but also um, ended up getting sort of folded into the conception of the work um, in and of themselves. After I spent a few years pretty exclusively building these large sort of fungus forms, I was really ready to go back to um, ritual objects and kind of like this idea or sort of playing with ideas around functionality. And at the time, I had been rewatching for the like millionth time Sex in the City, which was like a very kind of important touchstone to me as like a young trans person, a young like femme person, as sort of problematic and really like dated. Like I feel like Sex in the City sort of doesn't hold up, at least like politically or something. I mean, it didn't sort of like do much politically then, but as a kind of cultural like sort of touch point, it held a lot of weight for me. And I was rewatching it as an adult, and in the last season, this character Charlotte converts to Judaism, and I just remember watching this, so for the first time as an adult, and in this overhead shot as she's walking down these steps into a mikveh, which is like a Jewish ritual bath, as part of her conversion um, rituals. The converting person like walks down into the bath and immerses completely like a number of times and says a series of blessings, and then is sort of reborn a Jew. And when I saw this image, this sort of shot from the TV show, I was like, oh my God, the mikveh is a tiled space, and the tiled space is a ceramic object, a ceramic interior. And I became like completely obsessed with the mikveh as this ceramic ritual space that's sort of engaging um, Jewishness and kind of transformation into Jewishness. It also gets used a lot in Orthodox Jewish practice around the menstrual cycle. And so there's a lot of complicatedness around sort of purity law and really like the kind of purity and integrity of like a woman's body, a cis woman's body, a menstruating woman's body. And even I think through the problematics of that, I continue to be really interested in this space and this form, and started to see that there were a lot of queer and trans Jews using immersion in a mikveh as sort of ritually connected to their sort of practice, Jewish practice, but also their kind of identity as like queer and or trans Jews. And so that became really exciting to me. It felt like kind of an inherently queer space, this kind of relationship to liminality and water and kind of transformation, even if that transformation is sort of like purity, for better or for worse. And so I started making a lot of work about mikvah, and it's really, I think it continues to be a major theme or kind of interest of mine. So, I really think of those sort of small vessel forms as in relationship to mikvah, I think like vesselhood in general is in relationship to mikvah, though there's a lot of kind of um, minutia in Jewish law around how a mikvah is not actually like an object, it's like a space. It's like kind of an interior. And at the same time, I think as a queer Jew, as a trans Jew, I felt um pretty like not concerned with like following laws, but actually just exploring ideas as they came up and sort of felt relevant. So I started making these really large vessels. This piece was for Bay Area Now 8 at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. Um, and I built this form as a single object and then cut it apart as it was drying to then fire and reassemble. And then I built this kind of mechanism into it where it's kind of bolted together um, from the outside, where you get the kind of contrast of the red clay, but also the kind of wonkiness of coil building on the exterior. And then on the interior, there's this kind of ornate, like very kind of layered surface painting, and the aesthetic or the kind of narrative that I was developing here is this idea of the kind of mystic, or I was thinking a lot about alchemy, the alchemical androgyne, this kind of like sacred trans body that in this case is in relationship with um, fungus and mycology. So I brought into the conversation this relationship to mycotheology, which typically is like taking hallucinogenic mushrooms to have a kind of like experience that feels religious, right? Like um, uh, psilocybin or some kind of hallucinogenic fungus that allows you to be closer to the divine. And I guess my question here was like, could the fungus itself be an expression of the divine? Like maybe we don't use fungus as a tool, uh maybe fungus like sort of is the thing that we're sort of engaging in. It is this kind of expression of, in my mind, like kind of divine queerness. And so I built this or painted this surface that depicts the kind of androgyne um, harvesting and becoming fungus in a kind of circular way. Um, Pretty soon after I built that work, I was invited to go to Kohler to do a residency there. It was a 3-month residency that I did in the winter of 2019. So it was very, very cold, which was actually kind of amazing because the pottery factory at Kohler is kept at like a balmy, like 90 something, maybe 92 degrees, to maintain the kind of drying process of their product. And so it was this kind of like steamy, humid oasis in the midst of like -20 degree Sheboygan, Wisconsin. So it was really kind of exciting. And this is my studio mate um, walking into the factory one morning. Um, and when I went to Kohler, I had initially kind of been thinking about um, what it means to be a trans person entering into this space that produces all of these kind of bathroom appliances, that is not only like the kind of producer of bathroom appliances, but really kind of developed what we understand as the kind of contemporary bathroom space, which holds so much trauma for trans people. And I think I went in with this idea of like, what if I like make a gender neutral bathroom that's not just like designated gender neutral, but is actually like designed to be gender neutral. I don't know what that would look like, but I'll do some research and kind of see what comes up for me. And while I was there, I was able to access the Kohler archive, which was this kind of incredible opportunity. And I was doing a lot of research about this question that I kept having of like, why is the white surface so emblematic of bathroom appliances? like that white glaze that like we see everywhere is called like Kohler white. Um, and I kept putting it on things in this residency and thinking like, oh, I'm putting like the toilet glaze onto, whatever, this tile. And it suddenly becomes like a bathroom thing because of its sort of glossy whiteness. And I started to learn a lot more about the sort of context with which the bathrooms were being designed and engaged as very much sort of folded into um, practices around purity and the church and the body. And that became very exciting to me. Also, this image on the left is really the only overlap that Kohler did with like a religious institution. They made for a very short period of time this sacrarium, which is the sort of uh, the kind of waste vessel, I guess, that holy water is disposed of into. And this like didn't really exist for very long, but it's really like the only religious object that Kohler made. And they had one. There's like a tour of the factory, and they had a sacrarium there. And I was like, this is such a wild object that it's like sinks, urinals, toilets, bidets, and like a sacrarium. And I was really thinking about like if Kohler was designing ritual objects, like what would they look like? And I was like, I'm going to make a Kohler mikvah. And it sort of became very clear that like 3 months is not nearly enough time to develop a Kohler, like a new Kohler product, even if it's sort of like an art object. But what I did sort of settle on um, is the way that there was so much waste coming off the factory floor, and the studio is sort of right next to the factory. It's like there's like really no boundary. There's just kind of a designated space for the artists in residence to make work. And I started pushing this like plastic cart around every day and collecting waste. And then going back to my studio and doing what I sort of thought of as like Frankensteining the materials together. And I really started to think about like not what would the ritual objects that Kohler makes look like, but like if we were sort of gleaning the waste from Kohler to refashion it into queer ritual objects, what would they then look like? And I sort of settled on this idea of sort of wash forms, sort of in line with my relationship um, to sort of washing rituals, but really kind of playing with like more visible seams and really kind of leaning into what kind of a failed object might look like. And so this happened a lot where I would like build a thing and then it would just fall apart. Was really glad I was sort of taking photos of the objects while I was there, because things like this happen where I spend days painting these forms and then stick it in the kiln, and then it like tips over in the kiln and completely shatters. But I was still sort of collecting the forms and firing them to just kind of have a collection of these kind of failed objects. And really, I was thinking about how, as a queer person in this space, as a trans person in that space, I'm already sort of like failing. Whereas, like an artist in a production space, I'm already failing. And so I sort of have nothing to lose. I can really kind of lean into um, playing with the integrity of the form. So I'll show you a couple images of some objects that I was making there. This is like a medical sink laver with these like toilet tanks on top and all of these sort of faucets, playing with kind of tulipier forms again, the kind of multiplicity of the spouts, and piling images and sort of symbol together. This is a double urinal like wash basin. Again, sort of layering and really painting images that are engaging either sort of Jewishness or religiosity in relationship to queerness. And so these sort of like foot tapping under the bathroom stall images, which is like this queer cruising ritual, and sort of thinking about like both the erotics of the bathroom space, the kind of queer erotics of the bathroom space, and also the kind of organization of bodies in a bathroom setting. Coming back from Kohler, I was doing more research around ritual baths, and I got the opportunity to go visit the Oakland Mormon Temple. And Mormon temples kind of across the board utilize this baptismal font that is inspired by the mikvahs, ritual baths in the first temple in Jerusalem. So this is a enormous bath on the back of 12 cast iron oxen. And this kind of pairing of vessel with organism felt like kind of an exciting way that actually my interests in organisms, sort of like aliveness, fungus, could start to intersect with my interest in ritual and sort of vesselhood. So I sort of use this visit to be a kind of touch point in another residency that I did like only a couple months after getting back from the Kohler residency. I was invited to go to Cal State Long Beach to make some work there, and they have humongous kilns where you can make these enormous ceramic objects and fire them in sort of single pieces. So I was invited to come make some work, and I started to play with what it looks like for a vessel, the kind of myolica or kind of surface painted vessel, to intersect with this kind of proliferating fungus form. And so painting the piece on the left and chain hoisting the object out of the kiln on the right, which was like terrifying and also like very exciting. The kind of production here at Long Beach is very amazing. Here's some images of the work. I also have been making quilts for a long time, kind of parallel practice, and this felt like kind of an exciting way to complicate the materials to sort of make quilts for these objects. So this one has a quilt draped over the side, this tub. Here's the interior, the glazed interior of the piece. And then this piece got a quilt on the interior. But while this piece was being shipped to Craft Contemporary in LA for an exhibition, the art handlers actually like slipped while they were trying to move this like many 100-pound object, and they snapped the corner of the base off of it. And I got this kind of panicked like FaceTime call from the art handlers and the assistant that I was working with at Long Beach. And they were like, "What do you want us to do?" And I was like, "I'm actually like kind of, well, like, you know, whatever, don't panic, just get the object to the museum. But also like, I'm kind of not interested in trying to pretend that this didn't happen. And so what I'd actually like to do instead of repairing it is to find a way to make some kind of like prosthetic or something like that." So I was actually connected with a furniture maker in Pasadena, and I sent this image on the left, this like kind of terrible Photoshop image where I was like, I want something that's like if a prosthetic of that corner sort of hybridized with like a caned chair, so you can like see into the interior, but it sort of functions like a ghost of the broken corner. Could we do something like that? And he was sort of surprisingly game for that challenge, and we built this kind of amazing prosthetic for the corner. So here's an installation view from the Jarosa in Napa. And here's the image of the quilt on the interior. But it was really exciting. It was sort of like this moment to, again, complicate the material makeup of the objects, and also play with integrity again, right? Like what happens when the sort of permanent ceramic object breaks because it's inherently like a fragile form. How do we kind of engage the breaking, and really kind of lean into the opportunity of the kind of material failure? From that work, I started building kind of smaller iterations of that kind of static object, sort of painted object fungus hybrid, and was thinking about the 5-gallon bucket as this kind of beautifully ubiquitous utilitarian vessel. I had learned that death and burial societies in Jewish communities were actually using 5-gallon buckets to pour water over the recently deceased to sort of clean them before burying them. And there was something so poetic about such a kind of like crass object being used for such an important ritual. And my first instinct was like, do I make 5-gallon buckets that become these kind of exquisite ritual objects? And then I started thinking about like maybe I'm sort of uplifting the plastic 5-gallon bucket and actually talking about kind of the holiness of the object in its ubiquity, or it's like the holiness in its crassness. So I did a series of 10 of these. And this is one of the installations for a solo show that I had in Boston. And I had the gallerist in Boston sort of find 5-gallon buckets for me where she was and just kind of bring into the space and hybridize with the objects a kind of relationship to the immediate sort of setting. And then some of the recent work that I've been working on lately is trying to think of not necessarily just objects in a space, these kind of, the autonomous object in a gallery space or in my studio, but actually like what happens if the gallery or my studio is sort of brimming with that kind of proliferating life in and of itself. So what happens if this kind of fungus is like growing on the interior of the space that we're in? And so I started making these like corner pieces, pieces that sort of fit into a 90-degree corner, which I was really thinking of as like this very queer architectural area, the kind of like corners or like edges where planes are meeting. So here's like 2 versions of that. And some unglazed pieces, which I've been kind of excited about lately, in that they kind of do that like white glaze and red clay thing, that kind of contrast that I really like about some of the vessel forms. And so I'm sort of playing with unglazed, but maybe sort of like deeper fired work installed around the studio. So this image on the left is like in my studio. I just have these like big kind of fungus forms that are, in my mind, kind of taking over the studio space and thinking about like the architecture itself as the kind of vessel, which, I guess, as I sort of say that loud, is really what that kind of argument of mikvah, sort of the kind of objectlessness of mikvah, is that it's like a space, not an object. And so I think with this work, maybe I'm starting to think about like what the architecture can kind of offer as this kind of, as this vessel or as this kind of like holy interior, and maybe like the fungus is kind of marking that. And that this is really kind of like what I'm thinking about now and kind of what I'm working on moving forward. So that's it. That's what I've got for you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Nicki, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insight with us this evening. We have a few minutes set aside to introduce some questions from the audience. So for everyone watching, you can type the questions in the chat box on the right side. of the page on YouTube. Just check if we have any. So if you all want to occupy that, fill in some questions. I do have a quick question. In your texts, you talk a lot about conversation, and you're introducing a lot of subjects that are conversing with each other, whether that's material or conceptual. What do you see the significance of conversation in your interpretations of your object?
I mean, it's an interesting question, I think, primarily because I don't know that I've ever really thought about conversation in relationship to objects. I guess maybe I've thought about it a little bit. Like a reference point that I had was like when I was at Long Beach, I was making these like huge objects, and this museum was like, oh, we want to show a piece of yours. And I was trying to think of a way to kind of articulate that, like, this is a body of work. These are like multiple objects, and I really want them to be shown together. Like, how do I articulate that? And the sort of suggestion that one of my colleagues at the time was saying was like, I mean, it's a conversation, right? It's like a dialogue between objects. It's not the kind of like singular statement. It's about the kind of back and forth. And so there's something kind of rich in that. I think as somebody who grew up with like a very kind of visual and kind of material art-based practice, interest, drive, the kind of text and kind of writing component of like my life and practice felt sort of like maybe underutilized, differently utilized. And I've always felt kind of rusty about sort of like writing, or like it doesn't sort of, I don't feel as like articulate in my sort of writing skills. And I started to explore really like when I was in grad school, I was working with the artist Ann Walsh Jr., who has this kind of prolific kind of text and visual art practice. And I really started experimenting with what like dialogue could be as like a generative, both like act, performance, and sort of text generator. And so over time, I've really developed a lot of texts that have been based on like the dialogue and the possibility of kind of the back and forth with colleagues, people I like love and respect and am interested in.
Awesome. And we do have a question in the chat. Has your identity expression ever driven you away from religion and how it's practiced in the modern world?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I think that like my relationship to queerness and transness, which felt intuitive, like inevitable, I sort of like couldn't escape my relationship to my body and the way that I sort of move through the world. And my sort of dynamic or like ongoing relationship with Jewishness or with religious community felt like something that I was choosing to be in or sort of opting into. I don't know how like true that is, but that's sort of how it felt as like a 13-year-old. And so it felt like, you know, if I have no way of sort of seeing myself reflected back in my Jewish community, it makes more sense. It feels more comfortable to sort of walk away from the community to explore what's going on with my like queerness and transness. And I think it's only as an adult that I've been able to re-enter a relationship with religiosity or like a religious kind of practice and identity, and actually see my queerness, my Jewishness, and actually like my art practice as like inherently woven together and like sort of supporting each other. Yeah, those are like kind of really, really important now, but was very much at odds. And actually, like, maybe this is just like a very Jewish thing, but that conflict is actually the generative sort of axis of all of this work, that like they're never not at odds with each other. All of these sort of ways of being in the world, and that conflict is generative and like actually like super important to how I engage these things.
Fantastic. Do you have time for one more question here? We've got one more in the chat.
Sure.
In the mycotheology series, you state that the mushroom itself may be the object of religion. You say this could be an object of divine queerness. Could you speak more on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, not sort of denying the fact that there are mycotheological practices that have been existing, you know, for long, long periods of time in communities and like regions of the world that I like don't have access to. I think that like I'm very much aware of the fact that this idea of mycotheology is not like a new thing. I'm not pretending that I'm like inventing this. I think that I'm excited about the idea of maybe reframing the direction that the kind of energy is being placed in a sort of mycotheological engagement. I mean, I also just think all of my work is like about sort of asking questions or sort of like proposing ideas and sort of putting objects into the world and saying like, what about this? Could this be a thing? And so that was very much like being engaged with that work. Like, is the mushroom a sort of queer entity? I kind of feel like yes, that it's this kind of asexually reproducing, kind of like abject, like disgusting, but also kind of beautiful flowering organism that is like connected to itself and other organisms under the ground via a sort of like intense, like enormous network of mycelium that then sort of like pops up through the dirt to like eject spores and like reproduce in this kind of uncontrollable, prolific way. Fungus, mushrooms feel very queer to me. They feel very kind of like trans to me, and I guess I would say in the same way that I think of transness as this kind of divine way of being in the world. There's this kind of spiritual relationship, I think, to transness, to sort of operating in the world in this kind of liminal body. I think similarly, like fungus has that kind of liminal quality. And so engaging it as like an extension of queerness or another iteration of kind of an organic queerness, and therefore sort of divine and sort of exquisite and complex is kind of like where I'm at with it, and really kind of comforted by that and kind of inspired by it.
Yeah, and you're finding this conceptual richness that just hasn't had enough attention yet. It's wonderful. All right. Well, we do have to draw our conversation to a close. So thank you all for attending the final installation of the fall series of the Visiting Artist Lecture. And a special thank you to our guest tonight, Nicki Green. Thank you for your presentation, for your engagement. Everyone have a nice evening, and we'll see you in the spring.
Take care.